Okay, so let's talk about CSS or cascading style sheets. So as I mentioned earlier, the HTML has uses ASCII text, right, to describe to a browser how to lay out the page, right, where that thing should be rendered in a particular order, how to break up the content into subsections and whatnot. But it's not meant for describing how it should look, right? Such as colors, background colors or font sizes and whatnot. Instead, we use style sheets, CSS style sheets. So CSS style sheets allows us to break the roles into two distinct set of skill sets, right? Whereas HTML allows us to focus on how is it that we're going to render all this dynamic content. CSS is going to then go in and paint it and make it look pretty, right? And they're two distinct languages with their own syntax, with their own rules. We often refer to the CSS as a declarative language that basically declares or states that certain things are so. All right, it's not a programming language in such that it does, we don't have any loops or decisions or dynamic anything. There's no dynamic here, right? Everything is static, is predefined, stating how certain things should be statically. So let's look at some first uses of CSS. Here we have an HTML document on the left-hand side. Right? We have headers. We have two headers, heading 1 and heading 2. And here, notice how it's rendering on the right-hand side. Right? Here the H1 is rendering in the normal black color, right? CSS style attribute, there it is. Whereas over here we have this being rendered as green. Right? And the way we achieve that is by using the style attribute. Right? We're saying we know that there are some default attributes that you have. I want to override some of your attributes. Okay? And here we are overriding the color attribute, and we're setting it to green. So everything in here, right? This piece of text here, that is written in the CSS language. Right? Everything outside is HTML. Right? So we are embedding a CSS string inside of an HTML document, right? Using the style attribute. Okay, and we're just saying plain old color green, and it only applies to the header that is being applied to. So it has a very narrow scope, only to that one H2. Make sense? And this is perfectly fine. Other than that is applying styles directly on elements is considered to be bad practice. Okay, you should avoid applying styles right on an element. Okay, and we'll talk about why is that in a second. So let's look at another example. Order of precedence. Do I have an example of that? Also, it's typically considered to be bad practice to have any styling whatsoever actually encoded on the page itself. Okay. Instead, it's preferable to grab all that styling, all those styling rules, all that written in CSS, and instead put it in a dedicated file, right, with an extension CSS, and then refer to it from the document that you're trying to style, right? And we'll see that in a minute. Let's look at another example. Here we have a div out here, right? We have another H1 here that here before we were using the style attribute, right? In this case, what we're doing is that we are applying, we're configuring the class attribute instead. Right? Before we were using the style attribute, and here instead we are configuring the class attribute, and we're giving it the value blue color. Yes? Okay. And somehow, just by applying that blue color, it's blue. Now, who says that it's blue? Now, the way this works is that we have a dedicated file, a separate file, that the only thing that it contains is CSS rules in there. Okay, we have 3 rules here, right? And the way we know it's a rule is that each one has a curly bracket associated with it, right? So here's one rule. Okay, here's another rule, and here's another rule. Okay, it has 2 distinct portions, each one of these rules. On the left-hand side of the curly bracket, we have what is called as the selector, right? The selector, meaning this document, right? This document is being referred to by this other document, meaning this document says, "Hey, you paint me, you know, you style me." Right? So that document says, "Okay, fine, I'll do that." What it's going to do, it's going to refer to places in the original document, and it's going to say, "I want that portion of that document to have these colors, these fonts, this bold, this whatever." Right? It's styling. It's referring to portions of the document over here. This says, "Find me an element whose name is h1." Okay? And then see the dot here? It says, "And it has a class whose name is blue color." That make sense? Right? Find me an h1 whose class is blue color. And there could be many h1s that have a class blue color. Right? This one rule will refer to all of them. If you have more than one h1 in there with that class, it will refer to all those h1s. So this left-hand side has a proper name as a selector. It's selecting all the pieces of the document that match that one rule. Make sense? Once it matches that one rule, we're going to apply several transformations. Okay, listed all in between those curly brackets. Here we only have one transformation. Okay, the only transformation that we're doing is that the color, the foreground color used to be black, but we're transforming it to be blue instead. Make sense? Here's another one. Here's another h1. This is saying, "Find me all h1s, right, and apply the color red." Okay, and you might say, "Wait a minute, didn't we just talk about h1?" This is a very common thing that happens, is that these 2 rules are kind of competing against each other, right? They both are vying for the h1. They're both saying contradictory things about h1. Okay, well, not contradictory, but it's ambiguous. Right? There's some ambiguity. They both are wanting to do something with h1. They both want to transform it. And when that happens, right, certain rules apply on how to resolve these conflicts, right, or these inconsistencies, right? So one of the general rules is that the more specific a rule is, a higher precedence it has, right? If you have 2 rules that are referring to the same element, the more specific rule wins. And indeed, this rule is more specific, right, than this other rule. Okay, this one refers to all h1 elements, whereas this one is only referring to the subset of h1 elements whose class is blue color. Make sense? Right? So in that case, that one wins. Right? But even then, it might be that you might have certain inconsistencies, and also there's rules that take into account how close the transformation is to the actual element. Right? How close is it? For instance, this one is a little farther away than this one, right? In document order, right? So we take into account also the order in which things are declared, right? So we take into account how something is specific, right? In the order in which was declared, right? From top to bottom, right? And considering how close it is to a particular element, right? And we'll talk about those inconsistencies in a minute. So here we declare these transformations in. It's better to declare them in their own dedicated lines, right? It's easier to read. Here we have dot container that is being applied to this div over here. Notice that I didn't even bother to put a div in front of it. Okay, so this is being applied to all elements whose class is container. Okay. Here we are using the class as if it were an ID. Right? Really, the ID per se doesn't have any special behavior, right? That cannot also be achieved with a class, right? Here we're using the class as long as we make sure that container is unique, that I'm not using container anywhere else, right? It's being treated as if it were an ID, okay? And since I'm careful that this is the only place where container is being used, right? Here it makes sense. It would be redundant to say that this is a div. I'm sorry, a div whose class is container. It would be redundant, right? So it's fine to just use the class because I know it's the only place where it's being used. Make sense? Right. And what are we doing here? We are specifying a width of 600 pixels, and we're using a margin auto. Okay. This, in effect, what it does is that it centers the content in the page. Perhaps 600 is too much. Maybe we could do smaller, 300. We can run, right? And notice that we have set the width of the content to be 300 and margin. So the width of this entire content is 300 pixels. Right? And the reason it's centered is that we've set margins set equal to auto, meaning we have delegated the calculation of the margins, right, to the browser. It says, browser, whatever is left, right, on the around me, just spread it evenly around myself, right? And that's why you have this centering behavior. And this is a very common technique for achieving centering elements, okay, as opposed to using the center element, right? It's preferred to use these styling. Make sense? All right. And notice that it's always centered regardless of what the actual width of the enclosing window is, right? It's always centered. Okay. The class selector. Here we have another example. Let's look at this. Too bad you can't make this small on the left-hand side. Here we have a container. It's the same one, and we're using the class here to refer to anything that is blue. Right? Notice that here we're applying this blue color. Here we're applying it to the H1 right here. See that? And that's why this is blue. Right? But notice that we're applying the blue color to this paragraph as well. See that? Blue color. Right, and because in this case we like to apply the transformation to more than one element, right, or even two different types of elements, right. Notice that we have not put in front of the class. We have not put the name of the element. See that? Instead, we have just dot blue color. Right? This makes it a generic class that can then be applied to any number of elements regardless of their type. Right? But they can be equally applied to H1s as equally applied to paragraphs. Make sense? Okay. So yeah, so classes is very useful for that. Right, so remember, this dot means that we are referring to a class. Right? It's a class selector. Specificity, here's another example. Here you fill, what? Why is that? Oh, okay. Yeah, so here we have two that are referring to the same elements. And okay, we saw this already, right? This example. ID selectors. ID selectors, just like we use dot, right, to refer to there's a class being applied to that element. When we instead apply an ID to an element, we can refer to that part of the document by using the hash sign on the class. Right? This is read as find me an H1 whose ID, right? Well, that's what the hash sign says. Whose ID is head. Okay, so this is referring to this element right here, and only that one element, because IDs are meant to be used only once on an element. This one reads, we're highlighting an H1 whose class is blue color, which I don't have any. And so this was just illustrating the use of IDs. Inheritance. In HTML, you can have elements that are nested inside of each other. Okay, and elements that are inherited. Elements that are embedded inside of parent elements. They inherit any attributes that you might have modified for their parent. So if you modify the parent to be blue, right, all their children inherit that foreground color, right? But their children, as often they do, children often override their parent, the decisions of their parents, right? So a child element can override their parent and say, no, I don't want to be blue like you. I want to be green. So here we have a bold element inherited, right? That is overriding their parent. Their parent wants to be blue. There it is. Their paragraph wants to be blue. Indeed, if we remove this over here, if we remove it, and then we rerun it, notice that bold a child element inherited, right? Notice that its foreground color is blue. But children, as often, they override their parents, and they say, no, I don't want to be blue. I want my color to be red and my background to be green. Okay, it's overriding all the transformations from their parent, and notice that it becomes red on green. Make sense? All right. Let's see, what else? All right, I think we have enough to, oh well, I mean, we talked about the box model, right? I think we have enough to be dangerous. Let's review the assignment number 1, and let's actually start working on the first assignment. So you can start working on it this week. All right.